Alright, this picks up where we left off with the major conflicts or some of the major battles of World War II. We're going to start with the European theater. First one I want to look at is right here on the right side, the Battle of Stalingrad. This is a major Soviet victory against the Nazis. It is often seen as the turning point on the Eastern Front, and the Soviets started to push Germany back out of the Soviet Union. Large help for their success was, of course, the harsh Russian winter and the sheer number of troops that Joseph Stalin had at his disposal. Second one I want to look at is El Alamein down here in North Africa. This was in Egypt. Another major Allied victory. It was a tank battle, meaning it was mostly tank troops that were involved, and this was instrumental in helping to push the Germans out of North Africa so that the Allies could eventually invade Italy. And the third major European battle I want to look at is D-Day, or codename Operation Overlord. This was the amphibious or sea-to-land invasion of France, and due to this battle, the Allies were able to liberate France and from there move to liberate the rest of Europe and eventually defeat Germany. Next three I want to look at are in the Pacific. We're going to start with Pearl Harbor. This was the battle that got the U.S. into World War II. The Japanese attacked the U.S. naval base in Hawaii, in part to try and get rid of the U.S. fleet so that they could attack other islands, partly as retaliation for the U.S. embargo on oil and steel. Next battle that I want to look at is Guadalcanal. This was a major Allied offensive using the island hopping strategy. Major PR victory really started to push the Japanese backwards out of territory that they controlled. And the last one, of course, is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was the attacks on Japan that eventually led to the Japanese surrender. The atomic bombs, of course, were developed as part of the Manhattan Project. Alright, next part is the Holocaust. Looking first at reasons why the Holocaust takes place, the ideologies of the Nazis. The Nazis wanted to expand. They wanted Lebensraum, or living room, for Germans, ethnic Germans to live, meaning they wanted more space. The Nazis saw the Jews as inferior, in many cases as less than human, and as a result, the Nazis wanted to exterminate or eliminate all inferior races from Germany. And to do this, they start with legal restrictions, the Nuremberg laws, that start restricting the rights of Jews. And eventually it moves into outward violence at Kristallnacht, which was destruction of Jewish businesses and synagogues in Germany, the first outward violence against the Jews. Eventually, of course, moving into the final solution, when the Jews are rounded up, sent to concentration camps, and killed. As a result of the Holocaust, we do see war crimes trials, the Nuremberg trials, designed to try the Nazis for the crimes that they committed during the war. The United Nations develops a new word, genocide, for trying to eliminate an entire ethnic group. And it really brings back even more shock and outrage and anger at the Nazis as all of this is made public. Now, that's not saying that there wasn't some knowledge of what was going on beforehand. The Nazis certainly hadn't hid their racial ideologies, but the total extent of what was happening was not widely known. Alright, looking at the end of the war, there's two major conferences that take place, or diplomatic negotiations, between Britain, the USSR, and the US. These were the big three. So, Winston Churchill, of course, was the Prime Minister for Britain. President Roosevelt was the U.S. at Yalta. President Truman, of course, was at Potsdam after Roosevelt died. And Joseph Stalin was the premier of the Soviet Union. At the Yalta Conference, this took place shortly before Germany surrendered in February of 1945. And the major topic of discussions was dividing up Germany after the war into 4 occupied zones. Each of the big three would get a zone. So Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union France would also get a zone even though they weren't at the conference. They also discussed creating the United Nations, the international body that was designed to basically solve problems and keep the peace, trying to prevent going to war. Later that year, in Potsdam, the Big Three meet again. They're trying to finalize the occupation of Germany and make decisions about what's going to happen with Japan, because by the time the Big Three meet at Potsdam, Germany has surrendered, but Japan has not yet. At the Potsdam Conference, President Truman gets a message that the atomic bomb is ready to be used. It's been successfully tested. So he issues an ultimatum to Japan: surrender or face destruction. Of course, Japan did not surrender at that point, which did eventually lead to the U.S. using the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right, Unit 10, post-World War II. We're going to start with early Cold War policies and post-World War II policies. General MacArthur, one of the American generals in the Pacific, had a plan for Japan after the war. His idea was the U.S. is going to occupy Japan, meaning it'll be military government, military administration for a while, to restructure, rebuild the country, and rebuild the government so that the people in power prior to the war would not be able to try it again. The Marshall Plan was designed for Europe. It was an economic aid program where the U.S. gave millions of dollars to countries in Europe to help them rebuild from World War II, and of course to try and prevent them from becoming communist. The United Nations, it's an international organization, so there's lots of countries from around the world that are participating. The UN is designed to solve international problems and try to prevent future conflict. Now, not always successful, but it was certainly more successful than its predecessor, the League of Nations. NATO and Warsaw Pact are the two Cold War alliance groups. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was made up of Western European nations that were non-communist, the US and Canada. And this organization is designed to protect Western Europe from communist aggression. Basically, if the Soviet Union ever attacked Western Europe, NATO allies would come to their aid. And these two alliances together both contribute to increased tension in the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact was the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite nations, and really built as a defensive reaction to the formation of NATO. The nuclear arms race. This was when both the Soviet Union and the US built up their nuclear weapon arsenals. Neither one ever really used the weapons, but this was mostly due to the concept of mutually assured destruction, where if one country fired a weapon, the other one would fire back and they would both be destroyed. Nikita Khrushchev was the Soviet leader who really helped to spread the arms race. He was responsible for putting the nuclear weapons in Cuba, and he was very friendly with other communist nations. All right, looking at the Arab-Israeli conflict. This area, of course, right here on the east coast of the Mediterranean is Israel, formerly known as the Mandate of Palestine. After World War II, the United Nations created the country of Israel. It was designed to be a country for Jews. Initially, there was a partition plan in place that was designed to give the Arab Palestinians land and the Jewish immigrants or other residents land. The problem with this partition plan is both the Jews and the Arabs consider the territory their homeland. So when Israel immediately moved in to occupy these partitioned areas, the conflict over this territory is still continuing to this day. All right, let's look at nationalist policies after World War II, looking in China. Mao Zedong was the communist leader who came to power in China. He created the Great Leap Forward, where he restructured much of the farms into communes, large factory-like farms. Problem is, unlike Stalin's 5-year plans, Mao was not as successful, and millions of people starved in the famines. He then created the Cultural Revolution, which was really trying to restore and renew the communist revolution and get rid of anybody who was disloyal. The problem with the Cultural Revolution is it actually destroyed much of China's culture and imprisoned teachers and intellectuals, the people who could actually administer events, and left China with more mindless governmental robots, is the way I like to view it. After Mao, Deng Xiaoping came to power. So Mao was in power first, then Deng. Deng is a little bit more liberal than Mao. He got rid of all the communes. He got rid of all the failed projects from Mao. He only wanted policies that would work. So he did open China up to some foreign trade. He brought in more foreign businesses. However, Deng is still very much a communist leader. So as the Soviet Union is collapsing and democracy is spreading throughout Eastern Europe, students in China also want more freedom. So they start protesting in Tiananmen Square. Well, the army is called in with the tanks to stop the protests, and this essentially results in a massacre. Hundreds, thousands, some say hundreds of thousands, depending on whose example you look at. Many, many people died in this massacre. All right, let's look at India and South Africa. Actually, we're going to come back to this on the next video because I'm going to run out of time on this one.